Hi everyone, I thought I'd put together a short video to clarify some key concepts that we're going to talk about pretty much all semester, but for the purposes of this week, to provide some context to the women's movement, right? What has and does the women's movement continue to resist, continue to fight against towards the goal of gender equality? And it's these three concepts: patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. So we'll talk about what each of those are, and more importantly, how they're related, how they interact with one another to maintain gender inequality. So, I wanted to give credit where credit is due. This discussion is heavily based on the work of Dr. Kate Mann, an associate professor of philosophy at Cornell University. She recently published a really interesting book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, and she spends a lot of time talking about what misogyny is in particular. So I'm leaning heavily on the work in this book. I highly recommend it. You can check it out. So again, we're going to be talking about these concepts writ large, and why the women's movement in particular is focused on combating these with the goal of gender equality and equal access to opportunity for everyone. So let's take a minute here, and this word patriarchy, before we unpack it, I want to get a sense of what this word means to you. So go ahead and take a minute and just tell me what comes up when you hear this word patriarchy. There's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, so yeah, a lot of stuff, different stuff comes up for people when they hear the word patriarchy. Patri, right, the root of the word means male. And you can think of patriarchy not as a thing. You cannot buy a box of patriarchy at Walmart or order it on Amazon. It's not a thing, it's a system, right? It's this, you can think of patriarchy as this larger umbrella, this larger system that's embedded in every institution we have, from media, religion, education, family, healthcare, right? A system that functions to police and enforce gender norms and expectations, and involves girls and women facing disproportionately or distinctively hostile treatment because of their gender, amongst other factors, right? So we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but when we think about hostile treatment, that can be anything from violent acts of rape and sexual assault to the more sort of mundane, but I would argue equally insidious ways that we police gender behavior. So to that point, when we think about patriarchy, again, it's a very broad term, a very sort of 30,000-foot look at this system that maintains gender inequality, right? Through unequal pay, through abuse, through stereotypes, through limited gender roles, through the objectification of women, shaming language, portrayals of women in media and popular culture, right? So you can see patriarchy is very broad in scope. So with that said, what I'd like you to do is to take a minute and if you can give me an example of patriarchy and what it looks like. Where do we see it here in the United States? Okay, so our next concept is misogyny. Now remember, patriarchy is this sort of umbrella term, and these two other concepts, misogyny and sexism, fall underneath that. So here we have a pretty basic definition of misogyny, right? The dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women and those people, those ideas, those objects, those behaviors that are considered feminine. We're going to be talking about this a lot. Here we have a pretty stark example of misogyny. This is in 1967, the Boston Marathon. Up until that point, women were not allowed to compete in the Boston Marathon. Think about that, 1967. And here we have Kristen Salvers, I always say it wrong, physically being assaulted because she made had the audacity to try to compete as a woman in the Boston Marathon. So you have race organizers and participants violently attacking her for going outside of those expected gender norms, in this case, not to compete, not to be an athlete. So a pretty stark example of misogyny. But as we'll see this semester, misogyny comes in obvious and not so obvious forms. So with that, what is the relationship between misogyny and patriarchy? For lack of a better analogy, you can think of misogyny acts sort of like a shock collar does for dogs, right? So you can think of those collars that we put on dogs to keep them from misbehaving, right? And if they do something or go somewhere or behave in a way that we don't like, it will give them a little shock. and misogyny acts the same way, right? That if you go outside of those expected gender norms, there's going to be a shock. It could be, again, a pretty obvious violent one or a more subtle one. So it made me think of the Senate confirmation hearings of Chief Supreme Court Justice, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, you may recall from 2018. So I was thinking about specifically Dr. Blasey Ford, right? This woman who came forward and accused Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh of sexual assault. Now, whether you believe her or not, that's regardless of the point. The backlash that she got for speaking up was very real. And I wanted to share a short clip with you to give you a sense of the backlash that she got as an example of misogynistic behavior reinforcing patriarchy.
According to Business Insider, Christine Blasey Ford has still not been able to return home due to the volume of death threats she has received since she accused Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault, her lawyers said. Ford had feared her life would be upended when she came forward about Kavanaugh. The worst part is she's facing repercussions for her bravery, and Kavanaugh was confirmed as Supreme Court Justice Saturday, October 6th.
So again, the point here isn't if you believe her or not. The point is that the backlash she received, which was very real threats to her life and her family, so much so that she's unable to return to her former life, are very real. And I would argue that's an example of misogyny, right? That sort of shock to get her back in her lane, so to speak, in terms of appropriate gender behavior, right? So there's very much, you can think of misogyny as kind of the law enforcement arm of patriarchy. The other concept, of course, is sexism, and here's a pretty basic definition, right? The prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination typically against women on the basis of sex. So let's talk about what we mean by sexism more specifically. You can think of sexism, remember misogyny is sort of the law enforcement arm of patriarchy. You can think of sexism as kind of the ideological arm of patriarchy, right? So sexism is really about beliefs, ideas, and assumptions that serve to rationalize or naturalize patriarchal norms and expectations. So, for example, I was thinking about women running for political office. Oftentimes they are criticized for not being, quote, electable. Now, that word electable doesn't seem sexist on the surface, right? But, of course, beneath that are, I would argue, very sexist ideas, right? Sexist beliefs and ideas and assumptions that women cannot or should not be political leaders, that they're not either biologically cut out for it, as we'll see, right, or arguments that their temperament somehow makes them invalid as political leaders, right? So again, misogyny is sort of the action to get women back in their place, and sexism are the beliefs that support the action or the misogynistic behavior. So, of course, misogyny and sexism are also related, and they seem at first like a fairly simple, straightforward relationship, right? That if you must be sexist to be misogynistic, and I wanted to push back on that a little bit. Someone can engage in misogynistic behavior without necessarily having sexist beliefs about women. So I wanted to go back to the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh hearings as an example of that. Justice Kavanaugh's response to these criticisms was, I'm not sexist, right? I have hired a disproportionate number of women as law clerks, as colleagues, right? So very much not acting in a, quote, sexist way, right? But the minute that those women started challenging his authority, right, in any way, I would argue his behavior was misogynistic. So he wasn't necessarily sexist, right? He very much thought women were very much capable of being lawyers and going to college and getting professional degrees. But the minute that those women started to challenge his dominance and authority, that misogynistic behavior, that shock collar, would come back on, right? So unpacking the relationship between the two. Okay. So to recap, patriarchy, remember, is a system that is embedded in just about every aspect of society that functions to police and enforce gender norms and expectations. We'll talk about how this system changes, right? It can be fluid, but it also can be static, right? When we think about, appropriate gender norms and expectations. We'll be chatting about that more. Misogyny, remember, is the police arm of patriarchy, that shot caller, so to speak, and sexism is the ideological arm of patriarchy, those collections of ideas, assumptions, and beliefs. All right, I hope that was helpful. Take care.